For today's video, I'll be sharing a full month of care for my Walstad method cherry shrimp tank. This setup uses dirt capped with fine gravel with Rotala rotundifolia providing natural filtration and Christmas moss acting as a grazing area for the shrimp. Day 1 begins like any other with the shrimp left to go about their routine until feeding time at around 11 AM. Today I'm feeding them Hikari Mini Algae Wafers, but don't be misled by the name. Fish meal is the main ingredient, making these a high protein snack for the shrimp. I typically feed about a quarter of a wafer per 10 shrimp, and with roughly 15 adult and juvenile shrimp in the tank, I break the wafers down into small pieces like this for easier feeding. Unlike some other foods, these wafers sink immediately and settle at the bottom until the shrimp find them and start feeding. This clip is from about 15 minutes later, and as you can see, a lot of the shrimp have gathered to feast. I'd guess this is between 1/3 and a half of the shrimp in the tank, while the others continue grazing on the algae and biofilm, which is perfectly normal and nothing to worry about. On day 2, I decided to feed the shrimp Fluval Bug Bites bottom feeder formula, which has black soldier fly larvae as its main ingredient that is great for adding some variety to their diet. The larger granules make it easier to portion, and I usually add 1 granule per 10 shrimp. This amount of food suits the current population size and helps prevent overfeeding and water parameter mess-ups. This clip was taken within a few minutes of adding the food when the shrimp were still working out it was feeding time, but I had to leave the house so couldn't stick around to get more footage. On day 3, I went back to feeding algae wafers, as they, along with bug bites, make up the majority of the food that I add to my shrimp tanks. I tried capturing a time lapse of the shrimp feeding, and you can see the colony emerging from every nook and cranny in the tank to get the food. If you look closely, you can see the baby shrimp crawling out of the moss to join in the feeding frenzy too. As the adults eat the algae wafers, tiny little particles break off into the water column and spread throughout the tank, allowing the baby shrimp to feed without having to get close to the adults. On day 4, I chose to feed shrimp snowflake food, with the Glassgarten brand being my personal favourite, but there's plenty of options on the market. Some snowflake foods float for a little bit, but the Glassgarten variety sinks immediately and then starts to expand as shown in this sped up video footage. Snowflake food is primarily made of soy husks, so it is a low protein snack, but my shrimp absolutely love eating it. This clip was recorded just minutes after adding the food to the tank, and as you can see, the shrimp are swarming it as soon as they realise I've added it. As they graze, tiny particles break off which let the baby shrimp in the tank feed on it wherever they are. I noticed some of the juvenile shrimp grazing on the green algae on the tank glass and just ignoring the food. I also spotted a baby shrimp, likely from the last batch of shrimp born in the tank, as well as a female shrimp that is currently carrying eggs, so I can expect another batch of babies in a couple of weeks. Day 5 was one of the more eventful days of the month, as it involved some maintenance. I also decided to remove the air stone from the tank, since I really don't think that it's necessary. I have soft tap water, so I filled a 10-litre bucket, making sure the water was the same temperature as the shrimp tank, and then I added some shrimp salt to increase the GH and KH. If you have hard tap water, then this step may not be needed, and the minerals in your tap water could be enough to help your shrimp molt safely. I know that adding 1 scoop to a 10-litre bucket brings the GH of my tap water within safe levels for molting, which helps prevent failed molts and fatalities. Since this tank is at the top of my shrimp rack, I can't siphon water into it, so I use the bottom half of a soft drink bottle for the water top up. It is completely normal for shrimp to start grazing on the algae and biofilm that dried on the tank glass during the water evaporation after a water top up. You can see the shrimp swarming the glass, and this happens every time I top the water levels up in any of my shrimp tanks, so it's nothing to worry about if you see it in your own setups. Even with the shrimp grazing on the dried up algae, I did add some algae wafers to the tank. It really didn't take long for the shrimp to start abandoning the dried algae and biofilm and go for the higher protein wafers instead. I also introduced 2 platinum Medaka rice fish to the tank, as they theoretically make the perfect tank mate for cherry shrimp because they share very similar water parameters. I floated the bag to temperature match it, and then after an hour I netted the Medaka into the tank, avoiding adding the bag water that they came in. Initially, the Medaka seemed to chase the shrimp around the tank, which made me a little worried that I might have made a mistake, but I do think it's more out of curiosity because they'd probably never seen a cherry shrimp before. I added some NT Labs microcrumb for the Medaka, and after a while they realised it was food and started to focus on that rather than the shrimp. On day 6 I introduced some Fluval Bug Bites tropical formula for the Medaka to see if they'd eat it. It did take them a while to realise it was food, but once they did, they both started to eat the granules without issue, but I do think they're a little large for the Medaka. I also added some bottom feeder formula for the shrimp, and as usual they were all over it within minutes of the food hitting the tank. I was out of the house for most of day 7, so I fasted all of my shrimp tanks, with this being completely fine, so moving on to day 8. I fed the shrimp Bug Bites bottom feed formula again since they love it so much, and it's a bit more convenient than the algae wafers because there's no need to break them into little pieces. Thankfully the Medaka have settled in nicely and they are minding their own business and no longer show any interest in trying to eat the shrimp. I did notice a build-up of particles in the tank, which does start to bother me, but this is inevitable in this type of setup without any mechanical filtration and with minimal water changes. On day 9 I switched back to algae wafers to vary the main ingredients in the shrimp's diets. While I do prefer Bug Bites or snowflake food, this particular brand of algae wafers are a quick and easy way to provide my shrimp with fish meal. I did spot a new buried female carrying eggs during feeding time, and this one is different from the one that I showed earlier in the video, as this one is a higher grade with more vibrant colours, so the babies should be in the tank soon. I also noticed some tiny little baby shrimplets in the tank, though I'm not sure if they're from the female shown earlier in the video or another one. By day 10 I'd settled on NT Labs microcrumb for the primary food source for my Medaka. The tiny granules make it easy for the fish to eat it and they devour it quickly, so it seems that they really enjoy eating it. Since it floats, the Medaka get a chance to eat it within minutes, and I doubt the shrimp get much of a chance to try it. For the shrimp I decided to feed them some mulberry leaves. I use a drown jar to sink the shrimp weeks before feeding them, allowing the leaves to start breaking down and algae and biofilm to start developing. I used some tweezers to pull some of the leaves out of the jar and quickly place them into the shrimp tank. Here's a time lapse of the shrimp feeding, and out of all the different types of leaves I've tried with all of my shrimp colonies, mulberry leaves are by far their favourite. As the shrimp feed, tiny particles break off into the water column, allowing the baby shrimp to feed without having to mingle with the adults. It doesn't take long for a colony of this size to finish off one leaf that's been in a drown jar either, and I typically only add these once per month. On day 11 I opted to feed some snowflake food, which I usually use once per week for each of my shrimp colonies. As usual, the shrimp were on the food within minutes, happily enjoying their meal. I also noticed that the female Medaka was carrying eggs, so it looks like the two have started to breed in the tank, so I might get some fry in a couple of weeks. On day 12 I decided to add a shrimp lolly to the tank, which I typically use as a treat once per month, but my shrimp can be really picky with these. If you are in the UK, then my shrimp only really seem to enjoy the lollies from Forest Aquatics, and they usually just ignore the other brands that I've tried. Since the substrate in this tank isn't deep enough to bury the stick, I use a small airline suction cup to hold the lolly in place. It takes a moment to secure it because the wooden stick tries to make the lolly float, but it is easy enough to add them to a tank. Switching over to my macro lens, and you can see that the shrimp absolutely love these lollies, but I'm not sure what makes the Forest Aquatic versions different from the others. As the shrimp graze, small particles break off the lolly and fall onto the Christmas moss below where the other shrimp are feeding. Unlike with the other foods, most of the colony is either feeding directly on the shrimp lolly or on the small particles that drop off. It didn't take long for the Medaka to notice that there was extra food in the tank, and they quickly joined in on the treat and had their fill. By chance, day 13 was treat day for my 40-gallon community tank where I feed them bloodworms, so I did steal a few to add to my shrimp tanks. I use frozen bloodworm cubes, so I place one into a plastic cup with hot water and then leave it to defrost. As you can see, the shrimp lolly had been completely picked clean overnight, leaving the bare stick and suction cup in the tank. Forgetting I'd added the Medaka to the tank, I dropped the bloodworms in as usual. One of the Medaka was quick to try and grab one of the bloodworm, but it soon let it go, realising that it was far too big for its mouth. Surprisingly, the shrimp seemed uninterested in the bloodworm, which is one of their favourite foods, but I'm guessing it's because they're full from eating the shrimp lolly. I actually ended up removing the uneaten bloodworms within about an hour, and I just gave them to my Corydoras instead. Day 14 was eventful as I woke up to the tank finding it cloudy, prompting me to do a water parameter check. Unfortunately, I'd stuck to my usual routine, forgetting that I'd added Medaka to the tank, which effectively doubled or even tripled the amount of food being added. This resulted in an ammonia spike, a mistake that I'm still kicking myself for making, but it's easy to fall into routines and overlook significant changes in our tanks. I was genuinely worried since this is my oldest shrimp colony and I've had the original batch of cherry shrimp in here for almost 2 years. I prepared some clean water and performed a large partial water change to the tank to quickly reduce the ammonia levels. Shrimp don't like rapid changes in their water parameters, but I considered it essential as a 0.5 ppm ammonia level can be harmful to the shrimp and result in fatalities. Looking back, I do suspect that the ammonia spike was due to the extra food being added to feed the Medaka, as my yellow Neocaridina shrimp colony is roughly the same size as my cherry shrimp colony and fed the same diet, but they had no issues with their water parameters at all. After the water change, the ammonia levels returned to normal, but I decided to halve the food for the tank and gradually built it back up to let things adjust safely. For example, instead of feeding 5 bug bites bottom feeder pellets, I'd reduced it to 2, and then I'd cut the Medaka's food in half as well, bringing the total amount of food added each day closer to what would have been added before the Medaka were added to the tank. This shouldn't be a problem for the shrimp, as there's plenty of algae and biofilm in the tank for them to graze on if they get hungry. By chance, the small hang-on back filter that I'd ordered to handle the particulate matter buildup also arrived on this day. This pre-filter sponge isn't safe for baby shrimp, but the majority of the shrimp in these tanks tend to hide away in the moss anyway, so the population should still steadily increase. I did customise the filter media by replacing the included clips with 30 ppi foam to increase the surface area and prevent any future ammonia issues. I also added some filter floss for mechanical filtration to capture any of the particles in the tank's water to keep it as clean as possible. This filter should eventually offer a nice safety net against water parameter spikes, especially since this particular tank was never designed to also have Medaka in it, so they have significantly increased the bioload. Despite being exposed to high ammonia levels and going through a large water change, the shrimp remained calm and really didn't seem to mind, and they just kept focusing on searching for food instead of swimming around the tank in distress. I was dreading looking at the tank on day 15 because I was expecting to find dead shrimp, but thankfully the ammonia levels stayed within safe limits. To my surprise, both the shrimp and Medaka were going about their usual routines searching for food, and I couldn't see any casualties in the tank. I added some algae wafers sticking to the half feeding levels until the beneficial bacteria in the filter can slowly build up. As you can see, the shrimp seem perfectly fine and gather around the food just minutes after it was added to the tank. I plan to maintain this reduced feeding for at least 30 days and then gradually increase it in small amounts week by week as it becomes safer. I also decided to add some water lettuce to the tank to maintain safe and stable water parameters and to provide a laying area for the female Medaka's eggs in hopes of getting some eggs to hatch into fry. Ammonia levels were also good on day 16 and I fed some Fluval bug bites, but I was busy on this day so couldn't stick around to get any more video footage. On day 17 the ammonia levels remained low, indicating that the reduced feeding had resolved the issue. I fed the tank some algae wafers and the shrimp were eating as usual with no signs of any casualties from the ammonia spike. I did notice that the stem plants needed trimming, but I was busy this day as well, so decided to just leave it until my regular maintenance day later in the week. A few of the shrimp had molt rings forming on them and I was a little worried that it might be the ring of death, which can indicate molting problems coming up, and I was worried that it might have been caused by the ammonia spike. Thankfully, I've since seen many molts in the tank and I'm pretty sure that this was just the normal narrow molten ring indicating a healthy molt rather than the wider one that can signal a problem. I also spotted some baby shrimp in the tank, confirming that they'd survived the ammonia spike, which gave me some peace of mind on the full issue. Upon closer inspection, I also saw plenty of babies grazing on the biofilm hiding in the moss, which was a reassuring sign that things were back on track. On day 18 the ammonia levels remained low, so I decided to switch back to checking them weekly instead of daily. I fed the tank some spinach flavoured snowflake food from Forest Aquatics and the shrimp were on the food within minutes. While Forest Aquatics make excellent shrimp lollies, their snowflake food doesn't expand as easily as the Glassgarten variety and it just kinda clumps up in the tank. My Medaka have gotten quite good at swooping down and eating the floating particles released when the shrimp graze on snowflake food. Even with the Medaka grabbing some of these particles, there's still plenty of it left in the tank to spread around for the baby shrimp to find and eat. On day 19 I decided to break the norm of giving my shrimp tank snowflake food once per week to see if the Medaka would grab the floating particles again. My plan was to alternate between the different flavours of snowflake food each day to keep the overall food levels in the tank low to avoid any further ammonia spikes. However, something did come up and I had to leave the house before I could observe what actually happened with the snowflake food. Before I left I did notice a group of juvenile cherry shrimp happily grazing on the algae grown on the tank glass, which suggests that there's no immediate issues from the ammonia spike. On day 20 I fed the shrimp some bug bites which they quickly devoured. I also noticed a few shrimp at the surface of the tank eating the floating microcrumb intended for the Medaka, which made me think I might be underfeeding the tank given the size of this shrimp colony. On day 21 I decided to add some algae wafers and slightly increase the feeding amount for the shrimp, as I did suspect I might be underfeeding them. Cherry shrimp tend to breed according to the food availability in their tank, but with daily feeding the current population may be too large to reduce their food intake. Thankfully the slight increase does seem to be the right balance that I need, and I haven't seen the shrimp trying to grab the Medaka food anymore. I also spotted a buried female in the tank with eggs, which is a good sign suggesting that things have returned to normal after the ammonia spike. Day 22 was my regular maintenance day for all of my aquariums, so it was finally time to trim the plants a little, a task that I usually do once or twice per month. This shrimp tank is unheated, and with the ambient temperatures dropping as winter approaches, the plant growth rates are also slowing down, so I might only need to trim this once a month over the winter period. I focused on trimming the tips of the Rotala rotundifolia and Bacopa caroliniana stems to bring them below the waterline. Some people do prefer cutting the stems lower to encourage more growth, but even with the Medaka in here, the natural regrowth from these plants along with the filter should be enough to maintain water parameters through the winter. As the water temperatures drop, the metabolism of both the fish and the shrimp in here will also slow, so I'll be feeding less and less over the coming months, helping to keep the tank balanced. This is how the tank looked after trimming, and here's the plant matter that I removed. Afterward I fed the shrimp some bug bites and left them to go about their day. On day 23 I fed the shrimp some algae wafers and had a bit of free time to check the tank over. Thankfully everything seemed normal with the shrimp and they were basically feeding and just going about their business. I found a few molts in the tank, which is a good sign, suggesting the shrimp are molting properly, especially after spotting the couple with the yellow molt rings earlier in the video. I also noticed that the female Medaka was carrying more eggs, but I haven't been able to see where she's laying them, which makes it difficult to remove the eggs to improve the hatch and survival rates. On day 24 I fed the shrimp bug bites and one of the Medaka attempted to steal some food before realising it was too big for its mouth. I also checked the ammonia levels to make sure everything was on track, and I'm happy to report that everything looked good. I was busy toward the end of the month, so I ended up having to add the food and leave the house. On day 25 I fed snowflake food, on day 26 I fed algae wafers, on day 27 they got beetroot snowflake food, and on day 28 they got algae wafers. On day 29 I fed paprika snowflake food and noticed that the colony were eating a dead shrimp, the first fatality that I'd seen all month. Considering that I got the original shrimp for this colony nearly 2 years ago now, it's possible that this one dead shrimp is just from natural causes. It's always impressive to see how quickly the rest of a shrimp colony can consume a dead shrimp in the tank. I noticed that the filter floss was clogging up, so I decided to change it quickly to help maintain mechanical filtration and keep catching the dirty particles in the water. On day 30 I fed algae wafers, and as you might expect by now, the shrimp were all over them within minutes. I also decided to check the nitrogen compounds in the tank and everything came back within expected ranges. There were no dead shrimp in the tank today, which reassures me that yesterday's loss was an isolated incident and things are back to normal. I also spotted a buried female carrying eggs, so it looks like there'll be even more baby shrimp in the tank soon. So to wrap things up, yes, I made a mistake when adding the Medaka, but aside from that, this has been a typical month for maintaining this type of cherry shrimp tank. It's also worth noting that daily feeding isn't necessary for cherry shrimp, and I know plenty of people who feed their tanks 2 or 3 times per week. Aside from the ammonia spike, the maintenance was minimal, with 1 water top up and 1 plant trim for the entire month. This setup is ideal for anyone looking to get into the shrimp keeping hobby but wants a low maintenance tank that's easy to keep. The Medaka have proven to be excellent tank mates for the cherry shrimp, and I plan to add them to my other shrimp tanks soon. I will be adjusting how I add them to the tank to keep things as safe as possible though, and I will be controlling the food that those tanks get. That brings the video to an end, and I hope it's given a realistic look at what you can expect if you decide to keep a shrimp tank like this. Thanks for watching guys, and have a good day.